theater, and nearly 1,000 employees were idle in the Timken Roller Bearing Company in Canton, Ohio. The brighter side of that picture came with the return to work of 1,000 employees at the Hussey Steel Company in Pittsburgh. Other labor settlements were reached at Lockport, New York, and at Danville, Virginia. And here in New York, members of the National Maritime Union voted to cut short their vacations to man our invasion ships. The union requests all merchant seamen anywhere in the country to report for duty at once. I'll repeat that. The union, the National Maritime Union, requests all merchant seamen anywhere in the country to report for duty at once. You are needed. Bulletin from another theater, this time Italy. The entire government of Marshal Pietro Badoglio resigned today, and Prince Umberto, the new ruler of Italy, immediately requested the aged marshal to form a new cabinet. This cabinet is expected to include political leaders now residing in Rome and liberated by the advancing Allied armies. Until the new ministry is formed, however, the present government will remain in office to deal with current problems. This is Don Goddard speaking from the NBC newsroom in New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, throughout today and tonight, the National Broadcasting Company has cleared its schedule of all regular programs in order to bring you up-to-the-minute news of the invasion. And now NBC will continue its complete invasion coverage. And while we await further news, here is a short musical interlude. NBC has brought you a brief musical interlude.
At this time, it is our great privilege to present to NBC listeners the Right Reverend William T. Manning, Bishop of New York of the Episcopal Church, who has just come from the cathedral where he is holding services of prayer all day. Bishop Manning will now offer a special prayer in which he hopes all listeners will join.
O God, our Father, the God of justice, truth, and righteousness, we ask thy help and support in this great day of crisis. Uphold, strengthen, and protect those who are serving in the armed forces of our country and of the United Nations, on land, on the sea, and in the air. Be with them now in this great crusade for the overthrow of evil and for the liberation of the enslaved. Give them speedy victory for the sake of all mankind, and bring them safe home to us, if it be thy will. Receive into thy gracious care and keeping those who lay down their lives for us and for their fellow men, and to us at home give faithfulness to do our part without faltering, and strength to bear whatever loss and sorrow may come to us. We ask this in the name of Christ, thy Son, our Lord. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard the Right Reverend William T. Manning, Bishop of the New York Episcopal Church, who offered a special prayer on this day of national destiny.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special broadcast. In just a moment, ladies and gentlemen, we hope to take you to London to bring you an eyewitness account of a reporter who's just returned from the beachhead. We're awaiting his entry into a studio. In just a moment, we'll take you to the BBC in London. Just one moment. Stand by, please.
In 3 minutes' time, we will give a special program of 2 war reports from war correspondents. The first will be from John McAdam and the second from Howard Marshall.
Gentlemen, this is the NBC newsroom in New York. As you heard, our man over in London, the BBC, said that we'd bring you a special broadcast here in just about 3 minutes, an eyewitness account of one of our reporters who just returned from the beachhead. In the meantime, we have a bulletin here from London. The Vichy radio said tonight, it must be admitted that the Allied beachhead area has been considerably widened and that Allied reinforcements are pouring in. The National Broadcasting Company and its affiliated stations will bring you all the news of the invasion as rapidly as it is received. And here is news from another war theater. American bombers carrying out a half-dozen weekend raids against Japanese positions in the Central Pacific battered airfield runways and gun positions at Truk, Ponape, Nauru, and in the eastern Marshalls.
The attacks hitting islands in the atolls have just been announced by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. And here is the text. Truk Atoll was bombed during the night of June 3rd and 4th by liberators of the 7th Army Air Force. The airfields at Moyen and Paran Islands were hit. 4 enemy fighters were airbound but did not attack our force. Now I believe we're ready for our broadcast from the BBC in London for the special eyewitness account of a reporter just returned from the beachhead.
Report will follow after 1 minute break, duration 5 minutes 40 seconds.
As you heard, the man of the BBC, it'll be in 1 minute. In the meantime,
here is Allied War Correspondent John McAdam.
I was in at the start of the invasion in the second dicky seat of a glider tug. As we gathered round the leading aircraft on the runway just after midnight, the Americans were going out in close formation. Somebody, he must have been a navigator, said, "Why don't they give us pretty lights like these to steer by?" We saw plenty of pretty lights a little later, but not to steer by. Takeoff was fine until the second. Visibility was good, and the wake of the odd naval craft we spotted shone like silk in the clear moon. The Popeye voice on the intercom croaked, "This is going to be a piece of cake." And so it looked until just short of the enemy coast, we began to run into dense cloud. We went through that and came out facing the coastline. And there were the pretty lights. Hundreds of thousands of them, and all of them tracer. The enemy seems to go in for fancy tracer. Maybe it's to keep his gunners amused. There it was ahead of us like the Blackpool illuminations, and when it seemed obvious to us that we should call it a day and go back, the pilot put the nose of the aircraft into it as if it were confetti. Every now and then he called on the intercom, "Okay, glider pilot." The voice always came back, "Okay, skipper." These youngsters took it all in their stride. They chatted away to each other on the intercom as if the flak was directed at some other aircraft with nobody in it. "He's got his sights on us," the skipper would say. And somebody would come back, "He might hit us this time." As for me, I never said a word. The big test came on the run-in. We had to skirt belt after belt of this flaming stuff to bring the glider exactly over the zone it was to land on. It was a trying time for any aircraft, but for a tug and a glider linked by a strand of rope, it looked to me like suicide. But I was glad to be there, if only to see the pitch of mutual trust and regard these RAF air crews and the glider boys of the Army have reached. There was no question of casting off and getting out of it. The skipper said, "Glider pilot, are you all right?" "Okay, great. Well, hold on, son. There's a lot of stuff around here, but we'll get through it."
You have been listening to Allied War Correspondent John McAdam. In 1 minute's time, we will broadcast a report from BBC War Correspondent Howard Marshall.
And in the meantime, back here at the NBC newsroom in New York, we've just received a late report from Barcelona in Spain. German reports received here today say Allied forces are in full possession of Honfleur, and that is at the mouth of the Seine. Honfleur is just across the river mouth from Le Havre, and the harbor was enlarged shortly before the war. From Honfleur, the Allied forces were said to be fanning out to the east and south toward Point Audemer, 14 miles to the east. I'll repeat what this German report said, that Allied forces are in full possession of Honfleur at the mouth of the Seine River. Now, in just a moment, we'll take you over to London for a report by Howard Marshall. Just one moment, please. This is the NBC newsroom in New York. Just a moment, we'll bring you this report by Howard Marshall.
Stand by for Howard Marshall. BBC war correspondent Howard Marshall saw the Allied forces landing on the French beaches, and he has returned now to tell you his experiences. Howard Marshall.
I've just come back from the beaches, and as I've been in the sea twice, I'm sitting in my soaked-through clothes with no notes at all. All my notes are sodden and at the bottom of the sea. So, as it's literally a matter of minutes since I stepped off a craft, I'm just going to try to tell you very briefly the story of what our boys had to do on the beaches today as I saw it myself. I was in a barge which was due to pick up the brigadier of an assault group, and we were going in with the first assault wave. So we circled round with the various types of vessels, opening fire on the beach, which we could see quite plainly in the dim morning light, opening fire on the beach in their own manners and at the appointed time. First of all, the cruisers started with a rather loudly bang. And soon the air grew heavy with the smell of cordite and loud with the sound of explosions. And looking along the beach, we could see the explosions of our artillery creating a great cloud and fog of smoke. Well, we, in my particular craft, picked up our brigadier, not easily, because, as I say, the sea was very rough, and we headed straight for our appointed portion of the beach. We could see, as we went in, that that particular portion of the beach wasn't altogether healthy, and as we drove towards it with our planes overhead giving us the sort of cover we'd been hoping for and which we'd been expecting, as we drove in, we could see shell bursts in the water along the beach and just behind the beach, and we could see craft in a certain amount of difficulty because the wind was driving the sea in with long rollers, and the enemy had prepared anti-invasion, anti-barge obstacles sticking out from the water. Formidable prongs, many of them tipped with mines, so that as your landing barge swung and swayed in the rollers, and they're not particularly manageable craft, it would come into contact with one of these mines and be sunk. Well, that was the prospect which faced us on this very lowering and difficult morning as we drove into the beach. I tell you this, as I say, because it was the experience of so many other men at just this same time. We drove into the beach, swinging rather broadside on in the wind and the waves, seeing the jets of smoke from bursting shells near us in the water and slightly further away on the beach itself. And suddenly, as we tried to get between two of these tripod defense systems of the Germans, our craft swung, we touched a mine, there was a very loud explosion, a sudden shudder in the whole craft, and water began pouring in. Well, we were some way out from the beach at that point. The ramp was lowered at once, and out of the barge drove the Bren gun carrier into about 5 feet of water, with the barge settling heavily.
As usual, by newspaper, who is unfortunately detained, it will be read by myself. Hello, WLW. If you would like the name of the speaker tonight, I will spell out the name for you in 10 seconds. This is TAP Ankara with a service message to WLW. Hello, WLW. I'm going to spell out for you now the name.
This is the NBC newsroom in New York, ladies and gentlemen. You've just heard a report, an eyewitness account by Howard Marshall of the BBC, who has just returned from a beachhead with our armed forces there. It might be of interest to you to know exactly why the talk by Mr. Marshall had so many blank spaces. It sounded at times as though he'd been cut off. That's exactly what happened. Those blank spaces in Mr. Marshall's talk were caused by the censors. I have here a bulletin. OWI reports that the head of the German military authorities in France has issued strict orders to the people in certain departments of France, forbidding them to evacuate without permission under threat of being shot, or to go out of doors even in the daytime in the zone of actual military operations. The German radio is quoted. Throughout the day and night, the broadcast said, all doors must be kept closed, though not bolted, and the people in localities which may be included in the zone of operations must keep indoors, or, if necessary, in their cellars. Following is the text of the instructions as broadcast and reported by the Federal Communications Commission. From dusk to dawn, the population is forbidden to circulate in the streets. Until further notice, it is forbidden to circulate in vehicles and on bicycles, to form gatherings of more than 3 persons in the streets, and to gather either inside or outside of closed premises, except in homes and working premises. Local military authorities may grant exceptions regarding paragraphs 1 and 2. And to follow on with a quote, places of entertainment, public places, and restaurants must be closed. The sale of alcohol is forbidden until further notice. Throughout the day and night, doors and doorways of all buildings must not be locked or bolted. Windows must be closed from sunset to sunrise. No one must stand by doors or windows. Without the order of the military authorities, no evacuation must take place. And here is another bulletin, just handed us here. London, the Vichy radio said tonight, it must be admitted that the Allied beachhead area has been considerably widened. Further, Radio Vichy says it must be admitted that Allied reinforcements are pouring in on the beachheads. Now, just a few seconds that remain, we'd like to call your attention to a broadcast which follows in just about 30 seconds. The NBC International Division. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
To Roswell P. Barnes, Associate General Secretary of the Federal Council of Churches of Christ in America. Dr. Barnes.
I have combined the texts of a prayer issued for use on Invasion Day by the Right Reverend Henry St. George Tucker, President of the Federal Council of the Churches of Christ in America, and a prayer issued by the Archbishop of Canterbury for use in Great Britain. Let us pray. Almighty and most merciful God, Father of all mankind, lover of every life, hear, we beseech thee, the cry of thy children in this dark hour of conflict and danger. Thou hast been the refuge and strength in all generations of those who put their trust in thee. May it please thee this day to draw to thyself the hearts of those who struggle and endure to the uttermost. Have mercy on them, and suffer not their faith in thee to fail. Guide and protect them by thy light and strength, that they may be kept from evil. May thy comfort be sufficient for all who suffer pain, or who wait in the agony of uncertainty. O righteous and omnipotent God, who in their tragedies and conflicts judgest the hearts of men and the purposes of nations, enter into this struggle with thy transforming power, that out of its anguish there may come a victory of righteousness. May there arise a new order which shall endure, because in it thy will shall be done in earth as it is in heaven. Forgive us and cleanse us, as well as those who strive against us, that we may be fit instruments of thy purposes. O Lord God, we humbly dedicate to thee ourselves, our nation, and our cause. Place in thy hands all we have, and all we are, and all we desire. And unto thy most gracious keeping, we commend our loved ones and ourselves, ascribing unto thee all praise and glory, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Barnes. The International Division of the National Broadcasting Company, working in close cooperation with the Office of War Information and the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, plays its daily and nightly part in the shortwaving of truth to listeners outside the United States. Throughout the weary years of oppression, the messages which have told us of progress and of growing power have been told to the peoples of every country in their own languages. Throughout the long, early hours of this morning, we waited for the official announcement that would tell the oppressed of Europe that the concluding phases of their liberation had begun. What you who were listening heard, the people of the occupied countries heard, and so did listeners in every country hear whatever was broadcast to you. The question is often asked, but does anyone really hear your shortwave programs? Yes, they hear the shortwave programs from the United States, and by every means open to them, they try to let us know. Letters reach the shortwave broadcasters in the United States. Messages come through other channels. Someday, those thousands whose only light has been shed by broadcasting will be able to tell their stories. Here is one letter received a few weeks ago from a Frenchman. He is today a chief petty officer in the French Navy and on active service.
It may be of some interest to you to know that your international program is heard quite regularly in France. In 1940 and in 1941 on the West Coast, and in 1942 on the South Coast of France, I was a daily listener to your shortwave transmissions. Besides, they were not jammed like the medium waves by Vichy France and the Germans. Listening to your announcer in French yesterday afternoon brought me back memories. It was through your station that I heard that the German Lieutenant Colonel Hultz had been executed by 2 French patriots, Place Saint-Pierre, at 8 a.m. at Nantes in October 1941. I heard that important news at 6 p.m. on a Monday, and it made quite a change in the course of my life. This timely information was given by your announcer, Victor McCausland, whose voice I so well remember was clear and friendly. Yours very truly. You will understand, I'm sure, why I do not read the signature of this letter. The writer's wife is still in France.
This man had made 11 unsuccessful attempts to escape from occupied France. He was a marked man. The shooting of the German colonel by 2 French patriots was sure to be followed by mass reprisals. The writer of this letter knew that he'd be at the top of this list of hostages. It was through an NBC shortwave broadcast that he learned of Colonel Hultz's death, and this changed the course of his life. He fled, and this 12th attempt at escape succeeded. He's been to see our French section many times. That is simply one of a great many letters and messages that find their way through to this country. Since the early hours of this morning, the news which you have heard here has been told to other countries by the powerful shortwave transmitters of the United States. NBC's International Division has had its share in this work. In the hours that have passed since the news came, which galvanized the whole world, its members have told the thrilling story. Throughout the hours of tonight and the nights to come, these same people will continue to recount the unfolding of the story of liberation in 8 languages. To give you some idea of the work done here, members of each language section will between them, and in 8 languages, read General Eisenhower's thrilling message of this morning. First, in French.
Un débarquement a été effectué ce matin sur la côte française par des troupes du corps expéditionnaire allié. Ce débarquement fait partie intégrante du plan concerté des Nations Unies pour la libération de l'Europe, plan élaboré en conjonction avec nos grands alliés, les Russes. J'ai le message suivant à vous communiquer. Quoique le premier assaut n'ait pas été déclenché dans votre pays, le moment de votre libération approche.
Now in Italian.
Tutti i patrioti, uomini e donne, vecchi e giovani, hanno un compito da assolvere nel raggiungimento della vittoria finale. Ai membri dei gruppi di resistenza, guidati sia da condottieri nazionali che da capi alleati, io dico seguite le istruzioni che avete ricevuto. Ai patrioti che non sono membri di gruppi organizzati di resistenza, io dico continuate la vostra resistenza passiva, ma non mettete inutilmente in pericolo la vostra vita. Aspettate fino al momento in cui vi darò il segnale di insorgere e di colpire il nemico.
In Spanish.
Esperad hasta que yo os dé la señal de levantarse y golpear al enemigo. Llegará el día en que necesitaré de vuestras fuerzas unidas. Mientras tanto, os pido vuestra colaboración observando una estricta disciplina y un absoluto retraimiento. Ciudadanos de Francia, me enorgullezco de tener otra vez bajo mi mando a las aguerridas fuerzas francesas. Peleando al lado de vuestros aliados, desempeñaréis un papel de suma importancia en la liberación de vuestra patria.
To Scandinavia in Danish.
Da den første landgang er blevet foretaget på Frankrigs jord, gentager jeg med endnu større eftertryk mit budskab til folkene i de andre okkuperede lande i Vesteuropa. Følg jeres lederes instrukser. Et forhastet oprør af alle franskmænd kan forhindre jer i at blive til den størst mulige hjælp for jeres land i denne kritiske stund. Ha tålmodighed. Vær beredt.
Portuguese.
Como comandante supremo da Força Expedicionária Aliada, cabe-me o dever e a responsabilidade de tomar todas as medidas necessárias para a prossecução da guerra. A obediência pronta e voluntária às ordens que eu der é essencial. A administração civil eficiente na França será entregue em mãos de cidadãos franceses.
In Swedish.
Alla personer måste fortsätta på sina nuvarande poster såvida de inte får andra instruktioner. De som gjort gemensam sak med fienden och därigenom förrått sitt land kommer att avlägsnas från sina poster. När Frankrike befriats från sina förtryckare kommer ni att själva få välja era representanter och den styrelseform ni önskar.
In German.
Im Laufe dieser Kampagne zur vollständigen Niederringung des Feindes mögt ihr zu weiteren Verlusten und Schäden kommen. Sie mögen tragisch sein, aber sie sind ein Teil des Preises, den wir für den Sieg zahlen müssen. Ich kann euch die Versicherung geben, dass ich alles tun werde, was in meiner Kraft steht, um eure Opfer zu mildern. Ich weiß, dass ich jetzt auf eure Standhaftigkeit genauso rechnen kann wie bisher. Die heroischen Taten von Franzosen, ihren Kampf gegen die Nazis und die Vichy-Satelliten in Frankreich und im französischen Weltreich fortgesetzt haben, waren ein Beispiel und eine Ermutigung für uns.
And in English. The heroic deeds of Frenchmen who have continued their struggle against the Nazis and their Vichy satellites in France and through the French Empire have been an example and an inspiration to all of us. This landing is but the opening phase of the campaign in Western Europe. Great battles lie ahead. I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us. Keep your faith staunch. Our arms are resolute. Together we shall achieve victory. This, if you like, is a composite language picture of General Eisenhower's message. It will serve to give you a slight suggestion of the shortwave broadcasting from the United States to the whole world on a round-the-clock schedule. We return you now to NBC's invasion programs.
And here in the NBC newsroom, a bulletin has come to our attention which points to another theater of war. NBC monitors in San Francisco have just reported that the Tokyo radio has just left the air suddenly and without explanation. I'll repeat, NBC monitors in San Francisco have just reported that the Tokyo radio has just left the air suddenly and without explanation. Now back to the European theater with this bulletin. The secret German Radio Atlantic has just broadcast that the Germans, fearing an uprising of the millions of slave workers inside the Reich, have ordered all work camp and Stalag guards to be on the alert for weapons dropped from the air by Allied planes. Guards have been reinforced and stockades strengthened around the workers' barracks. The NBC monitors heard this broadcast. And at approximately 4:15, ladies and gentlemen, we'll bring you another eyewitness account, a special broadcast from London, a reporter who has just come back from the beachheads. In the meantime, we bring you some music. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for another eyewitness account of the invasion, we take you to London. NBC in New York calling London.
The first wasn't talked about very much, except from a purely technical point of view. It was something beyond our control, something desperately important, but altogether too big for us, something men only discussed in their prayers. But the second, we hoped, was very much under our control. In spite of the fact that the whole invasion force had to be trained and embarked within only a few miles of enemy aerodromes, every precaution had been taken to ensure that he didn't find out. A little Yorkshireman, looking round as he stepped out of a lorry and marched down to his landing craft, summed it up in 3 words. What? No bands? Yes, that was it. Here were thousands and thousands of men going off on what might well prove the greatest battle in history, with no bands, no cheering crowds to wave them on their way, but on the contrary, slinking off and taking every possible precaution to get away unnoticed. From the point of view of enemy action, last night was one of the dullest pre-assault nights I've ever known, and I've known most of them. As far as our own force was concerned, there was no interference by enemy aircraft, U-boats, or E-boats. And our only concern was the high, choppy sea which was playing havoc with some of the smaller craft. The sailors and marines who got those craft across worked miracles. By dawn, the sea still showed no signs of abating. And as the wind was from the northwest, it meant that the surf would be very, very dangerous in the shallow bay of the Seine. As the assault craft grouped into position, there was a terrific bombardment by cruisers and destroyers, combined with an intensive bombing on the enemy coastal batteries. Almost immediately, the coastal batteries answered back. And although I didn't see any actual damage done, some of their shells fell unpleasantly close to us. Those batteries were soon put out of action. The other main problem was, of course, that of the minefields. Minesweepers, the spearhead of the invasion force, were sweeping ahead of us during the night, and were now clearing the approaches inshore. And beyond the minefields, we knew that we must expect a large number of underwater obstructions, which must be cleared before the landing craft could have any chance of reaching the beaches. Specially trained volunteers, dressed in tight-fitting rubber sea-green suits and helmets, and looking rather like gnomes, leapt into the shallows to place charges and to blow up those obstructions. Believe me, they worked wonders. Meanwhile, the assault craft were creeping in. While over their heads, cruisers and destroyers and army guns on their way in put up a terrific barrage, while the Hun did his best to let us have it back. But in spite of the obstructions, the heavy surf and the minefields and the beaches, all the beaches in our sector were soon gained. And then started that mad rush to get the follow-up supplies ashore at greater speed than the enemy could muster his forces for his counterattack. When I left this afternoon, that mad rush against time and weather was at its height. As I came back across the 100-odd miles of English Channel to these shores, I shall never forget what I saw. There was no need for any navigation. It was just as easy as walking down Fifth Avenue. The whole way across the channel, there were continuous lines of craft approaching the Bay of the Seine. And not only continuous lines, but rows and rows of lines stretching out on either side as far as the eye could see. Our navies at this moment are undertaking the greatest task in their histories. May God allow those men fair weather to help them in this great adventure.
That was Commander Anthony Kimmons speaking from London. We return you now to the United States. You've been listening to Commander Anthony Kimmons of the Royal Navy, one of Britain's smartest naval men. He's been through 2 wars, took part in the Allied landings in Africa, Sicily, and Salerno, and returned to England recently after taking part in the Allied invasion of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. He had a front seat there as a British observer.
And now for another special broadcast, we take you to NBC in Washington.
This is the NBC newsroom in Washington. Just arrived in our studios is the ambassador to the United States from the Netherlands. As a representative of a country along the invasion coast, he brings a brief message to the people of America. Dr. Alexander Loudon, ambassador from the Netherlands.
We live through sacred moments. My personal reaction to the stirring news of the Allied landings on the European continent can best be expressed by referring to a beloved but very sick relative. When the early mornings has been put on the operation table, while the world's most skilled surgeons are doing their utmost to save his life. Naturally, all relatives and friends are impatiently telephoning to the hospital to hear the latest news about the patient's health. And the answer is, operation successfully performed and condition as satisfactory as can be expected under the circumstances. In other words, matters are in the hands of the military. Let them speak and strengthen us. Let no impatience on our part upset the patient's struggle to win. We must have faith in the military, aided by the fighting patriots. For the courage and devotion of all of them, we cannot but feel the deepest gratitude, love, and admiration. Our prayers follow them.
From the NBC newsroom in Washington, you have heard a few personal reactions to the invasion by Dr. Alexander Loudon, ambassador to the United States from the Netherlands. We return you now to the newsroom in New York.
Back once again in the NBC newsroom in New York. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we take pleasure in presenting that noted NBC commentator, Caesar Searchinger, who is also the analyst for the American Historical Association. Mr. Searchinger.
Good afternoon. First of all, let me tell you that General Eisenhower's headquarters in London will issue its second communique of the invasion at approximately 5:30 this afternoon, Eastern War time. This will be the first communication concerning the progress of the invasion. There has only been one before, and that was the bare announcement that the invasion had taken place. So, at 5:30 this afternoon, General Eisenhower will issue the first real communique on the progress of the invasion. The Vichy radio said tonight that it must be admitted that the Allied back beachhead area has been considerably widened and that Allied reinforcements are pouring in. Yes, it looks as though the invasion were a success as far as we've gone. It's now from 14 to 16 hours since the first Allied troops landed on the coast of France. It is definitely established by now that the main landings were made in the Seine estuary, not far from the port of Havre, that is to say, across the wide estuary of the port of Havre. The landings were made, however, on the south shore, where the fashionable bathing beaches are, such as Honfleur, Deauville, and Trouville. This 60-mile stretch of Normandy coast between the two rivers, the Seine and the Orne, is mostly flat and hasn't the steep cliffs of the coast north of Havre. Thus far it looks as though we left Havre to one side, though it must be one of our objectives, being the second largest port of France and the nearest to Paris. It was Napoleon I, I think, who said that Paris, Rouen, and Havre were really one city, with the Seine as the main highway in between. Speaking of Rouen, it is stated that our parachute troops are fighting inside the historic city, that city where Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. Prime Minister Churchill, in his second speech in Parliament today, said that our troops, ground troops this time, are fighting in the streets of Caen, C-A-E-N, Caen, 9.5 miles from the shore. Caen is an ancient city near the little river Orne, which flows into the sea about 20 miles south of Havre, across the estuary. This seems to indicate that at present we are heading southward, away from Havre. Caen is extremely important as a road junction. One of the main roads going out of it cuts straight across the Cotentin Peninsula, the peninsula that juts out from Normandy towards England, pointing straight at the Isle of Wight. Near the end of that peninsula lies Cherbourg, another great port which would be a valuable bridgehead for us. If our troops were to cut off this peninsula from the rest of Nazi-held France, we would have a large and highly protected area, roughly a triangle 60 miles wide at its base and 60 miles from base to apex sticking out into the sea. There are also reports from enemy sources that we have landed on the Cotentin or Cherbourg Peninsula direct. It seems logical, if the peninsula is our objective, that we should land at both ends at once, though the coast near Cherbourg is much more difficult because of the sharply rising hills. It's certain, however, that we have landed paratroopers on the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey, which lie between 20 and 30 miles off the west coast of the peninsula. These islands, as you know, are British territory, having been in English hands since the days of King John. This is the only British territory the Germans held in this war, and thus the first liberation of British territory has taken place. All this, the fighting in Caen and the landing of paratroops on the Channel Islands, does point in the direction of our aiming to use the Cherbourg Peninsula as a base of operations, possibly against Paris itself. Caen is a vitally important place both because it is on the railroad from Cherbourg to Paris and because it is the main communication point between western Normandy and the Seine, between Cherbourg and Havre. By the way, the city of Caen, where our soldiers are now fighting, has about 50,000 inhabitants and is a commercial town of some importance. It has close associations with English history, for it is where William the Conqueror came from and was originally buried. The castle, which is still used as a barracks, was built by the conqueror, and so were the famous Abbey Church, dating back from 1070, and other churches in the town. Later, Caen became the capital of Lower Normandy. It was besieged and taken by King Edward III of England during the previous English invasion of France in 1346, but it was lost again 4 years later. The University of Caen, curiously enough, was founded in the 15th century by Henry VI of England, who, I believe, also founded Eton College. Caen became one of the Huguenot towns at the time of the religious wars, and its medieval prosperity was shattered by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes under Richelieu. And now a word about Havre. Havre is the second seaport of France at the mouth of the Seine. It's 143 miles to Paris and 56 miles to Rouen. The name was originally Havre de Grace, after the chapel of Our Lady of Grace, which stood there when Havre was still a fighting village, which was until 1516. The defenses of Le Havre are very strong. They were built by Richelieu and completed by Vauban, the greatest of all French engineers. It was bombarded by the English 5 times in the 17th and 18th centuries, but no landings were ever made. Napoleon raised Havre to a port of the first rank, and Napoleon III completed the works begun by Louis XVI. In the First World War, British and American troops used the harbor. We used it as a base for landing troops and supplies. It is obvious that we shall need it again for the same purpose. Well, the marvelous thing about this invasion is that we really seem to have achieved surprise, that most valuable thing in all warfare, especially in oversea invasion. Admiral Ramsey of the U.S. Navy says he wouldn't have thought it possible, and he himself was surprised to see no more opposition against our armada. And this, mind you, despite the fact that the operation had to be postponed for a day on account of weather conditions. Of course, against the 4,000 ships and smaller vessels we employed, the Germans had little in the way of ships, a few destroyers and submarines. And submarines aren't much good in the channel because they can't submerge deeply. So, some things were in our favor, and so far, as I said, it's been a success.
You have been listening to the noted NBC commentator, Caesar Searchinger, who is also the analyst for the American Historical Association. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
.4:30 Eastern Wartime, your station, WEAF, New York.
This is Don Hollenbeck in the NBC newsroom in New York. First, 2 late bulletins from London. The German High Command says tonight that great enemy formations appeared at the coast of northern France between Calais and Dunkirk this morning. The great struggle on the northern coast of France has begun, a Nazi broadcast quotes the High Command. If true, this is a threatened landing on a new point of the French coast. The German DNB news agency reports tonight that Marshal Karl von Rundstedt and Marshal Erwin Rommel, Nazi commanders in Western Europe, are on the spot of the developments. Reports on invasion are pouring in, mostly from the enemy in recent minutes, and the enemy is busy making admissions. Admissions that our troops are pouring ashore at many places along the Normandy coast. A German broadcast says Allied parachutists have now taken over an airfield in the Boulogne-Calais area along the Dover Strait. That, of course, would be in an entirely new section of the French coast, more than 50 miles up from the earlier announced invasion area, which stretches all the way from Le Havre to Cherbourg. This new German report places the Allies in action directly across the strait from the cliffs of Dover, which, if true, would mean that the invasion is spreading out over a wide area. This unconfirmed news from the enemy says our parachute troops not only have occupied an aerodrome in the Calais area, but they have gained what is termed a foothold in that general area. Shortly before this report, NBC monitors here heard Berlin radio tell of a fierce naval engagement between Calais and Dunkirk. The British radio says that the Allied invasion line in France is now sufficiently broad to amount to more than just a beachhead. Of course, we know that additional landings are on the schedule, and from the flow of statements from the Germans, these landings are being carried out. Vichy radio has been heard saying that 200 Allied ships had been sighted off the coast above Caen, there where more men naturally would be expected to go ashore to reinforce those already landed and pushing inland. Vichy Radio admits that the Allied beachhead area has been considerably widened and that those fresh troops are leaving landing craft. Fierce fighting is taking place in the islands of Guernsey and Jersey, which lie west of the Norman Peninsula. This is another enemy report. Another German broadcast speaks of new Allied landings in the area of Carentan, just opposite the island of Jersey. I must point out here that all these reports are emanating from the Germans and, of course, must be regarded with great caution. From our own sources, the latest is more or less of a general nature. General Montgomery, commanding the armies invading France, who sent his men into battle with the message bespeaking great confidence and ending traditionally with the Montgomery send-off, good luck and good hunting. Montgomery says he's pleased with the initial phase of the operations. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King said after a conference with President Roosevelt that the invasion is doing all right so far. And here's another German report. Allied troops are said to have won full possession of the town of Honfleur at the mouth of the Seine River. Honfleur is just across the river mouth from Le Havre. The German propaganda agency, in a late summary, says that the Allied forces hold the coast for 15 miles between Villers and Trouville, which is to the south, across the Seine estuary from Le Havre. Prime Minister Churchill earlier told Commons that our soldiers have penetrated France, in some cases several miles inland, and that the first phases have been thoroughly satisfactory with losses far less than was expected. The Prime Minister told us that our airborne landings, the landing of the troops who bore the first front of battle, was an outstanding feat on a scale far larger than anything there has been so far in the world. The German report on this is at least 4 divisions of American parachute and airborne troops alone had been landed on the Normandy Peninsula. These troops from the sky created a major diversion, many demolitions. War-painted American Indians were among the first of these paratroops to land in France this morning. These Indians are a troop picturesquely self-termed the Filthy 13. They're well-trained demolition engineers, packing 180 pounds of equipment on their lean, hard bodies. As you no doubt have noted, any newscast at this time is well sprinkled with bulletins. That's how fast things are developing. And here's another one. 15 Allied cruisers and 50 to 60 destroyers are reported by the Nazi DNB agency to be operating west of Le Havre tonight. That's another enemy report. Every plane taking the troops this morning through the purple, cloudy skies of the dawn was painted with broad zebra stripes, blue and white stripes, and the planes carried colored lights. All this was to prevent a repetition of that Sicilian episode in which a number of our own transports were accidentally shot down by their own ack-ack fire. That brightly lighted armada, traveling only a few hundred feet above ground, stretched out, we're told, for 200 miles. Immediately following this broadcast at 4:45, NBC will broadcast at dictation speed the text of the prayer which President Roosevelt has asked the nation to repeat with him at 10 p.m. Eastern Wartime. The prayer is about 500 words long. If you haven't been able to get the text of it, this will be a good opportunity for you to copy it down in time to repeat it with the President tonight. The prayer will be given at dictation speed, 4:45 Eastern Wartime, immediately following this broadcast. The invasion, incidentally, was scheduled for yesterday, but was delayed because of the weather. The invasion overshadowed developments on other war fronts, but activity continues on these fronts. Russian armies are understood to be massing for blows against the Germans from the east. In Italy, remnants of the German army are fleeing in disorder toward some new sort of defense line in the northern mountains. The Fifth Army is pouring after the enemy across the Tiber River in many places. Allied communiques say the battle to destroy the enemy continues without pause. And as a footnote to this assault from the west, the south, and soon from the east, Premier Pietro Badoglio announces in Naples that he has dissolved his Italian government, is forming a new administration in liberated Rome. One more bulletin from Washington this time. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson has just told newsmen that first reports of the Allied landings in France indicated the long-awaited invasion was going very nicely. And here's a story overheard by our NBC monitors. The Nazis are suppressing news of the progress of the invasion and withholding the facts from the German people. Radio Atlantic, the German secret transmitter, says in a broadcast monitored this afternoon by NBC. What scant news that is put out by the German home radio is very confused and depressing. The people of Berlin have gathered in the streets in whispering knots, wondering where the next blow will fall. They know that nightfall and the hours of darkness now ensuing will mean more landings. Their prime question is, where? The clandestine transmitter, located somewhere in Germany, often has accurate reports of what's going inside the country. It's significant, the anti-Nazi radio points out, that though broadcasts beamed to Germany from England repeat the German claims of successes in naval engagements in the Channel, the Reich home radio has made no such statements. In all the volumes of bulletins, communiques, announcements, and stories of the invasion today, one great factor hasn't been mentioned. It may be that it's too early to get any reports. That factor is the French underground, the silent, secret army of patriots that has dared so much awaiting this day and which should at this very moment have flamed into action all over France. For days now, General Eisenhower's headquarters has been broadcasting instructions to this underground army, orders as definite and as important as any issued to the Allied troops waiting in England. Just today, General de Gaulle sent them orders from London. He declared that the Allied landings opened France's battle for liberation. Our NBC monitors heard de Gaulle urging Frenchmen to carry on the war behind the enemy's lines, to coordinate their work closely with the frontal attacks by the main Allied armies. And here in the NBC newsroom a few moments ago, we just heard Radio Brazzaville, the Free French radio in the Congo, broadcasting that the people of France, following the instructions of the Allied High Command, are prepared to take up arms in back of the German lines as one man. Vive la liberté, long live the United Nations, said Brazzaville. And that's France's reply to the orders of the Allied commanders. So far as we can learn now, no French fighting divisions have yet got into action. It may be, too, that this hasn't been announced, but we may be sure that French troops will be in the van of the march on Paris. Just now, it's up to that hidden army in France to strike where and how it can at the enemy, to follow the orders of their leader de Gaulle and of the Supreme Commander Eisenhower. I know something about this French underground army. In Algiers last winter, I used to meet some of its members who were reporting there for instructions, leaving France at great risk, using false names, crossing the Mediterranean, or sneaking through Spain any way they could, getting their orders and then going back at even greater risk. My French has a good deal of Nebraska about it, but I was able to get the idea of what this underground army was doing, just how important it was to the Allied cause. And I learned enough to wonder sometimes if people at home appreciated that. More, if even the Allied leaders appreciated what these underground patriots were up against. It's one thing to be a soldier with the dignity of a soldier and the assurance that goes with the proud wearing of the uniform, to carry weapons, to march and sail and fly under one's own flag proudly displayed. It's another thing to be a soldier in the dead of night, in the rags and tatters of a charcoal burner in the forest of Compiègne or on the docks of Marseille. He must move silently and swiftly. He must know how to dissemble. He must be able to keep his patriotism, his love of his country under control. He must pretend to bow to the enemy and to his own countrymen who have chosen to side with the enemy. These men we used to see in Algiers had drawn, tight, old looks about their faces. Even in that bit of liberated France, they were never quite sure whom they could trust, and they did well to be wary. For Algiers and Constantine and Tunis and the other cities of North Africa were full of the enemy. We switch you now to Washington for a special broadcast, the President's News Conference. Now to Washington.
Started there. On the air. This is Morgan Beatty in the White House in Washington. A few moments ago, the President held his first post-invasion press radio conference. President Roosevelt said that as of 12 o'clock today, American naval losses were 2 destroyers and 1 LST, that's landing ship tank. Losses relative to air landings were light, about 1%. He didn't say whether this meant personnel or ships involved. There were 181 reporters at the President's conference. Mr. Roosevelt said he felt the invasion was up to schedule, and, as Prime Minister Churchill would say, that is a mouthful. The President said that very few people here in Washington knew the timing of D-Day. You know, Mr. Roosevelt was alone among the High Command, the only one that had stayed up most of last night to follow the voluminous reports of invasion. He studied each dispatch behind the White House blackout blinds. They were pulled down, apparently, to avoid even the rumors that a light in the White House at midnight last night might have started something. So when the chief executive faced the Washington press corps this afternoon, he was well abreast of the latest developments, but he gave us only an inkling of what these developments were, and anybody who asked any questions about them that he didn't think was proper, he promptly labeled improper. He said, however, that he was very happy, and all the anonymous and silent people around him, he meant the White House staff that he works with every day, were all smiles today. He said he had little war news, but it was all right to cover the part about the losses. He said, as a matter of fact, that we newsmen were getting things as fast as people in the White House. The invasion was definitely up to schedule. When he was asked about how closely held was the secret of invasion, he said he didn't know. He said many people here in Washington and elsewhere knew that we were sending large forces over to the other side, but you could almost number the people on your fingers of your hand who on this side knew exactly when the date was going to be. The president was asked about when this date was set. Well, did he know about it in advance? And he said that he knew that the date would be approximately in May or in early June. As a matter of fact, he added, I knew last night as the boats loaded and started to cross. The date was chosen very largely, according to the president, because of the roughness of the English Channel. The weather factor was very important. He said that we needed what seamen call small boat weather to get people on the beaches in small boats. And then he was asked again if that was a major factor on the choice of the date, and he said definitely it was. Then some of the reporters wanted to know whether the invasion across the Channel was timed to gear up with the fall of Rome. You know, Rome only fell yesterday. No, he said, because we didn't know when Rome would fall. But he did say that you can now see why we did not institute a second front when the politicians and others started clamoring for it. He said we started planning for this thing, producing the arms in December of 1941, and today's action, or last night's, was the culmination of all that planning. He said that, obviously, the last 6 months gave us a tremendous chance to bring in many more divisions and landing craft. He was asked about the parish radio, saying he was going to London the last of June, and he wanted to know if that was the summer or the spring. That was his way of evading an answer. And here's a very important point he made just before the closing. He said, the thing we should be warned against at this moment is overconfidence. It's dangerous to the war effort. He said the war isn't over by any means, and this operation itself isn't over by any means. This is Morgan Beatty. I'm returning you now to the newsroom in New York from the White House in Washington.
This is Don Hollenbeck in the NBC newsroom. A quick summary now of the events of the day. The Allied invasion is doing well. Secretary Stimson has just added his report to that news. Mostly German reports say that we've made new landings. Enemy is busy making admissions that our troops are pouring ashore at many places along the Normandy coast. The new German report places the Allies in action directly across the strait from the cliffs of Dover. That would mean the invasion is spreading out over a wide area. These are all enemy reports, unconfirmed by our sources, and should be taken with caution. Shortly before this report, we heard Berlin tell of a fierce naval engagement between Calais and Dunkirk. The British radio says the Allied invasion line is now sufficiently broad to amount to more than just a beachhead. Of course, we know that additional landings are on the schedule. From the flow of statements from the Germans, these landings are being carried out. This is Don Hollenbeck in the NBC newsroom, and that's all for now.
Also with us in the NBC newsroom is our good friend Don Goddard.
Ladies and gentlemen, at 10 o'clock Eastern Wartime tonight, President Roosevelt will go on the radio and will lead the nation in a prayer that he himself has composed in this poignant hour. The chief executive would like to have the people of the nation repeat with him the words of this supplication, whatever their creed, making with him a common prayer for a common cause. The National Broadcasting Company is presenting these words at this time, spoken at a speed that will enable you to set them down. After a 2-minute interlude of music, which will enable you to procure pencil and paper, I will read the President's prayer, the prayer of the President of the United States, the prayer for the cause and the armies of the United Nations. and gentlemen, the prayer of the President of the United States. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness to their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard. The enemy is strong. He may hurl back our forces. Success may not come with rushing speed. But we shall return again and again. And we know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph. They will be sore tried by night and by day, without rest, till the victory is won. The darkness will be rent by noise and flame. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of war. These are men lately drawn from the ways of peace. They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They fight to let justice arise, and tolerance and goodwill among all thy people. They yearn but for the end of battle, for their return to the haven of home. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. And for us at home, fathers, mothers, children, wives, sisters, and brothers of brave men overseas, whose thoughts and prayers are ever with them, help us, Almighty God, to rededicate ourselves in renewed faith in Thee in this hour of great sacrifice. Many people have urged that I call the nation into a single day of special prayer. But because the road is long and the desire is great, I ask that our people devote themselves in continuance of prayer. As we rise to each new day, and again, when each day is spent, let words of prayer be on our lips, invoking thy help to our efforts. Give us strength in our daily tasks, to redouble the contributions we make in the physical and material support of our armed forces. And let our hearts be stout to wait out the long travail, to bear sorrows that may come, to impart our courage unto our sons, wheresoever they may be. And, O Lord, give us faith. Give us faith in Thee, faith in our sons, faith in each other, faith in our united crusade. Let not the keenness of our spirit ever be dulled. Let not the impacts of temporary events, of temporal matters, of but fleeting moment, let not these deter us in our unconquerable purpose. With Thy blessing, we shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemies. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. Lead us to the saving of our country, and with our sister nations into a world unity that will spell sure peace, a peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men, and a peace that will let all men live in freedom, reaping the just rewards of their honest toil. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen. That is the prayer in which the President of the United States has asked us to join him as he leads us at 10 o'clock this evening over the radio. And now a few news bulletins that have just come in. A bulletin from London. The Nazi-operated Vichy radio reported tonight that compact masses, that's in quotation marks, compact masses of Allied planes are bombing the Calais and Dunkirk regions of the French invasion coast. That's some 125 miles to the east of the landings made at Le Havre this morning. It means that our beachheads are expanding, that we are going to different portions of the coast. Dunkirk, of course, and Calais are nearest to the English coast. The German radio reports that Allied paratroopers have landed just across the channel from England, there in the Boulogne-Calais area, that those paratroopers have occupied an enemy airdrome there. If that is true, and there is no reason to believe the Germans would put out a false report of that nature, it means an Allied invasion thrust directly across the Strait of Dover, 100 miles or more above that Allied beachhead area on the Norman coast. We have no confirmation of any invasion activity in this area from Allied headquarters as yet. But already we are expanding our beachhead there in Normandy. And in Stockholm they're saying that Denmark has said today that German troops in the protectorate there have been ordered on an invasion alert since early this morning. And General Sir Bernard Montgomery says he is pleased with the initial phases of the invasion operations. General Montgomery heads the Allied armies taking part in the landings, as you know. Montgomery was quite happy as he told newsmen today that he'd given his officers a 5-point recipe for victory just before the invasion began. The 5-point recipe for victory, Montgomery said, was this: 1, Allied solidarity; 2, offensive eagerness; 3, enthusiasm; 4, confidence; and 5, all-out effort. That's General Montgomery's 5-point recipe for victory. And in Washington, Secretary of War Stimson, with smiles on his face, told the newsmen that first reports of the Allied landings in France indicated the long-awaited invasion was going very nicely. He's the second Washington official today to say that. Admiral King, chief of our navies, and a member of President Roosevelt's strategic board, said that when he left the president this morning. And we learn now that the Nazis are suppressing news of the progress of the invasion and withholding the facts from the German people. Radio Atlantic, which is a German secret transmitter, charged in a broadcast monitored this afternoon by NBC, that the German propaganda machine was letting only a trickle of news out to the German people. What scant news is put out by the German home radio is very confused and depressing, and the people of Berlin have gathered in the streets in whispering knots, wondering where the next blow will fall. They know that by nightfall and the hours of darkness now ensuing will mean more landings. Where, they ask. Their prime question is where. The clandestine transmitter, located somewhere in Germany, states all this today. It is significant, says this radio station, which is called Anti-Nazi, that though broadcasts beamed to Germany from England repeat the German claims of successes in naval engagements in the Channel, the Reich radio has made no such statements. It has not claimed that Allied ships were sunk in the Channel. The German radio people know only too well the deplorable state of their fleet. They recall the sober statement of a high Nazi naval official that they are up against the strongest fleets in the world. And in Washington, Henri Opinot, the delegate of the French Committee of National Liberation, says that French divisions soon will participate in the Battle of France and that French shock troops will help to open the road to Paris, the road from Le Havre, we suppose. Side by side with American and British divisions, French divisions armed with the magnificent material given to them by the United States soon will participate in the battle. French soldiers will fight tomorrow as they have fought in Africa and in Italy, where by the side of the Allies they opened the road to Rome. Tomorrow they will open the road to Paris. And Prime Minister Winston Churchill received today this congratulatory message from Premier Stalin of Russia of the Allied liberation of Rome. He said, "I congratulate you on the great victory of the Allied Anglo-American forces in the taking of Rome." This news has been greeted in the Soviet Union with great satisfaction. Those are the words of Premier Stalin. And the Berlin radio reports tonight that big air battles have developed over Romania today between Nazi fighters and bombers of the Allied Mediterranean Air Force. Soon we may expect the Russians to be on the push there. This news is brought to you from the NBC newsroom in New York by your commentator, Don Goddard.
This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Five o'clock Eastern Wartime, your station, WEAF, New York.
NBC again asks you to pause in prayer on this historic invasion day. Dr. Douglas Horton, Minister at Large of the Congregational Christian Churches, will lead us. Dr. Horton.
Let us pray. Almighty God, thou Lord of hosts, we humbly beseech thee for the men who on beach and in field, on the air and on the sea, now cast themselves into the battle for the liberation of the peoples of Europe and of all the world. Be to them, we humbly pray, a strong defense against the known and the unknown dangers of the onslaught, the soldiers' courage. Gird them with the armor of thine own Spirit. For those who suffer, we humbly pray that thou wilt be the good physician. Thou hast known the wounds of hand and of side. Sustain all those who are in pain, O Lord, as one who understands can sustain. We commend unto thee all those who will, for our sakes and freedom's sake, give up their lives. Grant to them the spirit of tranquility and trust. Give them to put their hope in thee. And having passed through the valley of the shadow in peace, we humbly pray that they may enter into the rest which thou hast promised. O God, thou art the protector of all nations. Into thy hands we commit the keeping of our own nation. We commend to thy fatherly care the President of the United States and all those in authority abroad, and give to us, O God, to do thy will as a nation. And this we ask through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Horton. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard a brief prayer by Dr. Douglas Horton, Minister at Large of the Congregational Christian Churches.
The National Broadcasting regular programs, so that all day and all night you'll be able to hear the latest news of the invasion as it happens. We're standing by now in the NBC newsroom. Any moment we'll get the communique from General Eisenhower's Allied headquarters somewhere in England, and also we expect to hear soon from our reporters in Washington. So now to continue our invasion program, we invite you to listen to the NBC Orchestra.
This is the NBC newsroom in New York, ladies and gentlemen. And now for a report on the President's press conference. We take you to Morgan Beatty, the NBC newsroom in Washington.
This is Morgan Beatty in the NBC newsroom in Washington. I've just returned here from the White House down the street, and I must say it's pretty hot in Washington today, and I'm just a little bit sleepy. As a matter of fact, the President's last question at his press conference was, "Mr. President, how do you feel?" Now, of course, the President's hair was neatly brushed, obviously, in reception of the press today, but he said, "I'm pretty sleepy," because the President was the only man among the high command here in Washington who stayed up all last night to receive the reports as they came in from General Eisenhower's headquarters in London. And these reports obviously were very voluminous because of the detail the President was able to give us today. But first, let's review a few of the major points at his press conference and then go into detail. The President said that as of 12 o'clock today, his reports from General Eisenhower showed that American naval losses were 2 destroyers and 1 LST, that's landing ship tank, one of these medium tank landing ships. The losses relative to air landing, he said, were light, about 1% of the forces involved. The President was asked in this connection whether or not 1% meant 1% of the men involved or 1% of the aircraft, and he said he was sorry he couldn't go any further than that. As a matter of fact, there were quite a number of questions at the conference today that the President smilingly, he was in a very good humor, the President smilingly characterized as entirely improper, and he said that the men who were asking them knew they were improper. As a matter of fact, they didn't think about whether they were improper. They were so curious to get at some of the secrecy and the things that have had to be secret in the past that might now be told. The President said that this much could be said. He felt the invasion was up to schedule as of this point. And as Prime Minister Churchill would say, that is a mouthful. And of course it is. The fact that we have achieved a beachhead or several beachheads in France at a very relatively small cost is one of the most amazing developments of this very long and amazing war. The President said that very few people knew of the timing of D-Day. He said, of course, a lot of people knew that we had tremendous forces going over on the other side, but that you could almost number the people on your hand in this country that knew exactly when D-Day was coming. Mr. Roosevelt opened his conference this afternoon by saying that he was very happy at his conference today. He said he and the anonymous and silent people all around him, that is the White House staff, the men that helped him all the time, were all smiles. Then he said he had very little war news, but it was all right to cover the points that we've already given to you. Then one of the men asked the President how long he had known the date of invasion. And he was asked also whether or not it was geared to time up with the fall of Rome. The President said he had known the date of invasion, or the approximate date, that is, ever since the Tehran conference last December with Prime Minister Churchill and Joseph Stalin. And he said, no, the invasion of France was not timed to gear up with the fall of Rome for the simple reason that we didn't know when Rome would fall. Then Mr. Roosevelt took occasion to go back and review the long preparations for this landing in France. He wanted to impress on us newsmen, very evidently, so that we would relay it to you that you just can't have a war and a great fight at the drop of a hat. He recalled that old story, the speech of the politicians, that in the days gone by, millions of men would spring to arms overnight in defense of America. He indicated that he thought that was a very pretty speech, but a lot of people, or a few people at least, always ask the question after a speech like that, well, where are you going to get the arms for these men to spring to overnight? And he said you just can't do that sort of thing, especially in modern warfare. He said we started planning this thing, we in America and in Britain, and producing arms in December of 1940. He was referring to the joint war effort, of course, and particularly to the American effort. And he said that we have now selected the earliest possible date for the infliction of invasion on the enemy. He was asked then if the last 6 months had given us a chance to double the invasion force. The reporter that asked that apparently had been told or had the impression that we were given another 6 months on this thing because we could double our invasion force and be that much surer of victory. But the President wouldn't quite agree with that point of view. He said he wouldn't say that, but obviously the last 6 months did give us a chance to bring in many more divisions, and landing craft particularly. He said that
as long ago as Tehran, he knew that the date would be approximately in May or early June. And he said, I knew last night as the boats loaded and started to cross. As a matter of fact, you know, the president stayed up in his study or in his room in the White House behind the blackouts. That was because, apparently, the White House didn't want anybody to get any suspicion or rumor started that there was a light up late in the White House in the president's rooms and probably something was up in connection with the war. So they had the blackout blinds drawn, and the president pored over the reports coming in from General Eisenhower and all the other commanders and possibly from Prime Minister Churchill there in his White House room. He did that, and he worked also on the prayer that he's been composing for several days, a prayer that he will give to the people himself, read to the people of the nation himself at 10 p.m. tonight. But to get back to that date, he said the date was chosen very largely because of the roughness of the English Channel early in the year. He said that we needed small boat weather. That's what seamen call weather good enough for very small craft to beach in. He said we needed small boat weather to get people on the beaches across the channel. Then he was asked again, just to be sure on this point, whether weather was the major factor in the choice of the date for invasion, and he said definitely yes. The president had one point he wanted to make to us toward the end of his conference. It was this. He warned us against overconfidence. He said that overconfidence was dangerous to the war effort. Then he told the story about a man he knew. You know, the president's fond of telling stories about men he knew, and some of the men think sometimes these men he knew at various times might be characters, montage, people sort of drawn out of his imagination, but nevertheless people who are very real somewhere. Anyway, he said something about a man he knew that came back from Italy or Sicily after the operations there with the impression that the war was all over. He said this man just threw up a good job and a very necessary job because he thought the war was all over and no further effort was necessary. Now, of course, you and I and lots of other people know people who did that very thing. I mean, the war charts, the charts on production in this country show very clearly that every time the Allies have a victory, a great number of people do quit their job. This operation itself, meaning the invasion across the Channel, this operation itself isn't over by any means. He says you just don't land and walk on through to Berlin at a moment's notice. And then was when the last question came in the conference, and how do you feel, Mr. President? All right, he said, but I'm a little bit sleepy. Mr. President, so am I. This is Morgan Beatty in Washington, returning you to New York.
This is the NBC Newsroom in New York. And for a continuation of our invasion coverage, we take you now to Louis Lochner at NBC in Hollywood.
From NBC's Hollywood newsroom, here is Louis Lochner, Pulitzer Prize-winning European correspondent who knows more about Germans in Germany than any other American.
Good afternoon. From Germany has come an item of news which, if borne out by subsequent developments, may have far greater significance than first meets the eye. It was reported last night that the great intuition corporal, Adolf Hitler himself, had moved his Führerhauptquartier, in other words, his GHQ, to Western Europe and had taken personal charge of the defense of the continent against the United Nations invasion. Of late, Adolf Hitler seemed to have been superseded by the old-line General Staff. More than that, Field Marshal General von Rundstedt, a holdover from the Imperial General Staff of World War I, was reported as placed ahead of the typical Nazi generals, especially Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, and was placed in supreme charge of the invasion area. If now Adolf Hitler has been put ahead of von Rundstedt, I cannot escape the conclusion that this is evidence that the General Staff, now as in 1918, sees far earlier than do the political leaders that the war is lost. Let me reveal a story today that, as far as I know, has not been told in this country. It is vouched for by one of my best and most trusted friends. This friend of mine knew well a former lady-in-waiting to the late German Empress Victoria Louisa, first wife of the deceased Kaiser Wilhelm II. Those of you whose memories go back far enough to recall some details of World War I will recall that during the first part of our struggle to make the world safe for democracy, the Kaiser was comparatively little heard of, at least comparatively little as regards managing the war. Publicity was spotlighted upon Field Marshal von Hindenburg, and especially upon that supposed super genius of strategy, General Erich Ludendorff. It was Ludendorff here and Ludendorff there. And as a symbol of Germany's will to win, General von Hindenburg was made just as popular as the propaganda facilities of that period permitted. For instance, a huge wooden, super life-sized statue of Hindenburg was placed on a prominent square, and anybody who contributed, I believe it was 1 mark, toward the German war chest, was permitted to hammer 1 iron nail into the statue. It was not long before the enormous statue no longer seemed to be of wood, but of iron, and was therefore dubbed der Eiserne Hindenburg, the Iron Hindenburg. When things began to go very badly for the Imperial German Army, however, the announcement was made one day that the Kaiser had taken over supreme command. Now then, the interesting revelation that this lady-in-waiting made to my friend was that in the bosom of the family, where only a few members were present, the Kaiser said to his wife and to such of his children as may have been there, such as the princess, "I am going to be the scapegoat in this war. The General Staff knows that the war is lost, and so it has decided that I must take the responsibility and head the armed forces. As sovereign of my people, I cannot shift responsibility. If a call of this kind comes to me, I must accept it. But I know that this is one way in which the General Staff wishes to escape the responsibility for defeat." Now, if these words are, as I take them to be, true, that the Kaiser said them on that evening, there are certain very interesting conclusions we can draw about the coming events in Germany. Even if, at the present time, the rumor should not prove correct that Hitler has taken supreme command, it will be interesting to watch and see when that moment arrives. And then you can be sure that the General Staff will try a repetition of what happened at the end of the last World War. Ludendorff was able to escape to Sweden. And just as soon as the young struggling republic got into difficulties and the Republican regime which followed the Imperial had to clean up a mess, General Ludendorff reappeared and became the backbone of the movement that finally built up Hitler and that is really responsible for bringing about the present war. So in conclusion, I would say, whether now or at a later time, Adolf Hitler assumes final responsibility, that is the moment when you can be sure that the General Staff knows the war is lost and is putting in a scapegoat.
You've been listening to Louis P. Lochner speaking from our newsroom in Hollywood. We return you now to NBC Newsroom in New York.
Back in the NBC Newsroom in New York, we now bring you some bulletins that have just been handed us here. London. 4 heavy bombers and 7 fighters were missing from 3 United States 8th Air Force heavy bomber missions against more than 100 targets in German coastal defenses today. This was announced tonight. A bulletin here from New York. The main transmitters of the Nazi DNB propaganda agency in Berlin went off the air for 48 minutes tonight without explanation, FCC monitors reported. The main transmitters of the Nazi DNB propaganda agency in Berlin went off the air for 48 minutes tonight without explanation. From Italy, this development. Crown Prince Umberto, newly designated Lieutenant General of Italy, today instructed Marshal Pietro Badoglio to form a new government to include the political leaders now in Rome. Badoglio received this commission after having tendered his pro forma resignation to Umberto. The government now in exercise will continue its functions in its present form until the new cabinet has been constituted. It was understood in Naples today that Badoglio and several ministers will go to Rome in the very near future in order to consult there with the erstwhile underground leaders, most of whom are unknown to the Italian public, regarding the formation of a new cabinet. And meanwhile, the official seat of the Italian government will remain at Salerno, inasmuch as the present military exigencies will not permit Rome to be placed under Italian jurisdiction. Badoglio sent messages of thanks for the liberation of Rome to Mr. Roosevelt, Mr. Churchill, and Mr. Stalin. He told Stalin that the Italian people know the heroic defenders of Stalingrad were present in spirit at the liberation of Rome. Keep tuned to this NBC station. At 5:30 Eastern Time, in just a few minutes, NBC expects to bring you an important broadcast from London. Here are additional bulletins. More news of how Moscow and all Russia reacted to the news of a Western front. Word spread through Russia like a wind-whipped fire today that Anglo-American armies had landed in France, and the people exploded with a spontaneous joy seldom even accorded their own great victories. The news came as Soviet armies themselves were poised to strike along a 2,000-mile front in fulfillment of the combined offensive from east, west, and south, worked out at the Tehran Conference. Instantly, the Soviets voiced a conviction that their Western allies would smash the Germans in record time. The swift capture of Rome convinced people here that the Allied armies carry a terrific punch. They expressed also a hope that the war will now be ended quickly. American correspondents were the first to announce the news to the Russians. It was not until later, at 1:45 p.m., that the Moscow radio quoted the number one Allied communique. Another bulletin just in. Tokyo held an emergency air raid drill today. The Japanese official news agency declared. Tokyo held an emergency air raid drill today. The explanation of the enemy action, usually taken only when Allied bombers are on the way, came later. And here's some late news on relief supplies for United States prisoners in Japan. The Soviet government has agreed to permit a Japanese ship to enter a specified Russian port near Vladivostok to pick up relief supplies for American prisoners in the Orient. In making this announcement today, the State Department at Washington says that stocks of supplies sent to Russia last year have been awaiting transportation. And another bulletin, Calcutta. Strong formations of Allied heavy bombers have given the Thailand capital of Bangkok its heaviest pounding of the war yesterday. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
WEAF, New York.
Just one moment, please, ladies and gentlemen. Stand by. We're expecting another special bulletin or a special broadcast in just a moment. We've just been advised to stand by for a broadcast from London that is apt to occur at most any moment. In the meantime, here in the NBC newsroom in New York, additional bulletins. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, June 6th. The American 9th Air Force flew more than 2,500 individual missions before 1 p.m. today. This was in the most violent 12 hours of aerial warfare in history, official spokesman announced tonight. And here's how the Moscow home radio broadcast the invasion news. British, American, and Canadian troops have landed this morning in France. The liberating forces are advancing, and no obstacle can halt them. The task before us is not easy. And no, the operation of transporting large armies over a changeable sea and their landing on a coast guarded by the enemy are the most complicated of all tasks known to military science. At the present time, our men are landing on a coast along which the enemy has created the most powerful defense zone that he could construct during 4 years of occupation. Our troops are already being subjected to counterattacks by specially trained enemy divisions that he has concentrated against us in France. This has been a day of momentous news, and not the least of the spectacular reports we have broadcast from here, the NBC newsroom in New York, was the eyewitness account of our Stanley Richardson, the first reporter to bring back a first-hand report from one of the naval ships which took part in the invasion. His report was first broadcast early this morning. Now, for the benefit of NBC's listeners, we bring you a transcription of this historic broadcast by Stanley Richardson.
People of Western Europe, a landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe, made in conjunction with our great Russian allies. I have this message for all of you. Although the initial assault may not have been made in your own country, the hour of your liberation is approaching. All patriots, men and women, young and old, have a part to play in the achievement of final victory. To members of resistance movements, whether led by nationals or by outside leaders, I say, follow the instructions you have received. To patriots who are not members of organized resistance groups, I'll say, continue your passive resistance, but do not needlessly endanger your lives. Wait until I give you the signal to rise and strike the enemy. The day will come when I shall need your united strength. Until that day, I call on you for the hard task of discipline and restraint. Citizens of France, I am proud to have again under my command the gallant forces of France. Fighting inside their allies, they will play a worthy part in the liberation of their homeland. Because the initial landing has been made on the soil of your country, I repeat to you with even greater emphasis my message to the peoples of other occupied countries in Western Europe. Follow the instructions of your leaders. A premature uprising of all Frenchmen may prevent you from being of maximum help to your countries in a critical hour. Be patient. Prepare. As Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, there is imposed on me the duty and responsibility of taking all measures necessary to the prosecution of the war. Prompt and willing obedience to the orders that I shall issue is essential. Effective civil administration of France must be provided by Frenchmen. All persons must continue in their present duties unless otherwise instructed. Those who have made common cause with the enemy and so betrayed their country will be removed. When France is liberated from her oppressors, you yourselves will choose your representatives and the government under which you wish to live. In the course of this campaign for the final defeat of the enemy, you may sustain further loss and damage. Tragic though they may be, they are part of the price of victory. I assure you that I shall do all in my power to mitigate your hardships. I know that I can count on your steadfastness now, no less than in the past. For the heroic deeds of Frenchmen who have continued the struggle against the Nazis and their Vichy satellites in France and throughout the French Empire have been an example and an inspiration to all of us. This landing is but the opening phase of the campaign in Western Europe. Great battles lie ahead. I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Keep your faith staunch. Our arms are resolute. Together we shall achieve victory.
You have just heard the Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
It has just been announced that General de Gaulle has arrived in England. He will broadcast a message to the people of France later in the day.
Back in the NBC newsroom in New York, and ladies and gentlemen, as we announced in error that it was NBC's Stanley Richardson who was about to broadcast to you. Of course, as you know, it was General Eisenhower's historic message to the peoples of occupied Europe. Stanley Richardson is a good man, too. Great credit to Richardson and his staff for helping us out in these moments. And now here in the newsroom, beside me at the microphone, is NBC's Elmer Peterson, who will take over for a moment.
We're waiting now, and we should receive it very shortly, for another communique from Allied headquarters somewhere in England. These communiques, these official communiques, as you know, are worded very carefully. And so far, you will have noted, there has been great caution in the wording of these communiques by the Allied leaders. Every effort is made to be sure that the communiques are exact, that the communiques avoid any over-optimism, and so far, there has been, in our own communiques, there has been nothing of the detail that we have received from sources in Germany and in neutral countries. Allied headquarters in Britain at this time, of course, is a very busy organization. It's composed of staff officers. Somewhere General Eisenhower is watching every development. Somewhere he's in constant touch with those exciting developments across the English Channel. And from these reports, brought back in every conceivable manner, brought back by plane, by courier, brought back by shortwave, the actual wording of the communique is evolved. This communique, which we should receive very shortly, should, of course, give us a better idea of just how far we have advanced. It should give us a better idea of how much progress we have made, and it certainly will give us something to use in balancing the Allied version of the fighting against the version we are receiving from Germany. For this must be remembered. The Germans have a certain propaganda value in the reports they're putting out about the fighting. Fundamentally, the Germans are sitting back, in a certain respect, waiting to see just what the invasion is going to develop into. They have to watch to see just where the main thrust is going to come. Because, fundamentally, they must attack hard at the point where the pressure is going to be greatest. And so far, there has been no indication that this landing on the Normandy coast is the main thrust. We may develop another offensive far larger. We may develop other diversionary offensives. Here we're getting a test of what Churchill once promised us, namely that we must expect feints and false thrusts and rehearsals. So the Germans in their communiques, in their pronouncements, are trying to create the impression, of course, that fundamentally the Allies are advancing here and there. They're trying to create a certain impression which the Allied communique, shortly to be received, is going to correct. It's important that we should watch these Allied communiques and take them literally. It's important that when it comes to a final judgment of what's going on, we should base our impressions on the official Allied communiques as received, and if we pay attention to the reports from neutral countries and from Germany, they must always be accepted with a certain amount of caution. And here's some news just arrived from London. It's probable that Prime Minister Churchill will give an almost day-to-day account in the House of Commons on the fortunes of the Western Front following his 2 appearances today. We've always known that Prime Minister Churchill likes playing reporter. He's always enjoyed a certain dramatic touch about his announcements. And certainly the British Prime Minister must like his present role of informing the world in the House of Commons on day-to-day developments. The Berlin radio has reported tonight that big air battles have developed over Romania today between Nazi fighters and bombers of the Allied Mediterranean Air Force. It's a significant report because, after all, we're still waiting to see what the Red Armies intend to do. Those Red Armies have been preparing for many months, for many weeks now. The Germans have been counterattacking north of Iasi in Romania, obviously because they expect an offensive in that direction. And then we've had the report of the new shuttle bombing program using airfields in Russia. Altogether, it indicates that some action can be expected from Russia very shortly. And the speculation in London is that within 24 to 48 hours, and certainly before this week is over, the Red Army will be taking its full share of the final attack. And here's the late news from the Russian war front. Large forces of German infantry and tanks today again launched a series of futile counterattacks against Russian troops north and northwest of this Romanian rail hub of Iasi. All the assaults were beaten back, the Red Army High Command announced, with the Nazis losing at least 49 tanks and 42 planes. And while we're watching developments in France and in the southeast Europe, it's also well to keep an eye on North Europe. We have the Nazis encircled now on three sides, but there's still a fourth side. And the Nazis have been feeling out in this direction. They've been making predictions that the Russians may even go so far as to attack across North Finland into North Norway. And this is not without likelihood. After all, the Arctic route has been cleared. Our convoys are now sailing directly to Murmansk without interference. We've demonstrated that we have a certain amount of air superiority over North Norway, over North Europe, and this may lead to developments which will eventually see Germany being attacked from all sides in Europe instead of only three sides. A late Berlin broadcast admits that a strong formation of glider-borne Allied paratroops have succeeded in gaining a foothold on both sides of the road from Carentan to Valognes, south of the great French port of Cherbourg. The broadcast said this force has received reinforcements during the morning and at noon. Already, the parachute troops of the Allies have made an impressive result, but we must expect them also, before the invasion is over, to penetrate deeper and deeper into Allied territory.
Thank you, Elmer Peterson. Ladies and gentlemen, we're still standing by for this Allied communique direct from London. In the meantime, continuing our invasion coverage, our invasion program, we invite you to listen to the NBC Orchestra.
heard a musical interlude in our invasion program by the NBC Orchestra. This is the National Broadcasting Company.